So I was asked by Brother Rob for a title of my study, and I had a kind of hem and haw because I didn't have one. This is actually a continuation of what I started back in May or June of this year. Brother Jacob, when he was teaching Habakkuk, had to leave for a couple Sundays, and he asked me to fill in. And at the time, what was kind of prominent in the news was the anti-Israel protests that were taking place on the college campuses across America, and of course the actions of Israel in her excursion into Gaza. So I thought, hey, I got 2 weeks to fill. Why don't we just touch on it since it's kind of current events? And then I kind of thought that was the end of it. I was asked to take over for Jacob now he's finished Habakkuk, and I have no idea how long I'll be teaching here, but what I thought was just simply pick up where I left off, because I remember when we were talking, there was some misunderstanding as to where I was coming from. There were some that seemed to think that I was speaking against Israel, attacking Israel. Unfortunately, one of the problems when you're teaching classes is often, and you have dialogue and discussion, is questions may be raised which would be answered if I could get to the end of the class, which kind of then slows my ability to get to the end of the class because I'm dealing with comments. So I know there was some pushback, and I can totally understand because I'm bringing up, of course, topics which could be seen as controversial. So I thought I would just kind of pick up where I left off. Hopefully it will not be as confusing perhaps as it was back in May and June. All right, so to kind of give you a little bit of background, that was a little bit of the background. At the time back in May and June, there was on the world stage, remember there was an item about the International Criminal Court seeking to put out an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, along with also I think one of the Hamas leader responsible for the October attacks last year. And there was also the college campus protests. Why I'm bringing this up is I don't think we should shy away with addressing the growing anti-Semitism that's occurring in the world. And I also think we should be willing to be critical of Israel at times. You've got to remember that the nation of Israel today is not the kingdom of God. It's a political entity. And just as you might have some criticisms against the US government, some policies, it's fair game to have some criticisms to a political entity that happens to be in the Holy Land named Israel. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm anti-Israel or that I'm anti-Zionist or that I hate the Jews. It's just simply making observations as what's taking place in the news. But the primary thing I wanted to focus in on is how all this is stirring up increasing feelings of anti-Semitism. That's really where I wanted to go. The anti-Semitism, that sentiment that you're seeing, I think is actually going to get worse as time progresses. And if Israel, in fact, triggers some type of Middle East war, if there's always this fear now that Iran is threatening Israel, that Israel may retaliate if Iran retaliates, and we could have an escalation very quickly. If Israel provokes this or escalates this and creates some type of a major war in the Middle East, I would bet you there's going to be some anti-Israeli sentiment as far as what's taking place, what is going to then develop from those actions. So anti-Semitism is important, especially if you consider our young people today are going to be the leaders tomorrow. We don't know when Jesus is going to return. We think that it's going to be soon, but it could be 20 years, could be 30, 50, 100 years. I have no idea. But I can tell you, based upon what you're seeing on the college campuses, that the young people are out of touch with the history of the Holy Land and the history of the Jewish people. And these people, the young people, protesting today on college campuses, I can bet you that they will be part of our political process 10 years, 20 years down the road. And it is important, I think, to look at where we are today and how the world is changing with respect to its attitude and view of the Jews. So that's kind of like why I'm bringing this topic up. Now, I'm going to try to bring the Bible in. I just don't want this to be a lecture on anti-Semitism. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a sneak peek into where we were and where I'm going and my motivations. Now, why don't we just simply start with the obvious? I always think if you're going to have a discussion, make sure you define your terms. So let's define our terms. Anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? Well, according to one dictionary, I've got it up here on the screen, anti-Semitism is hostility or prejudice or discrimination against Jews. So I'll repeat that. Anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. A person who holds such positions is called an anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism is widely considered to be a form of racism. Now, this next part here, this next paragraph, I actually had to learn something here. I was actually under the impression that anti-Semitism, the term, is not totally correct because the term Semite refers to more than just the Jewish people or the Hebrew people. What's interesting about this is that the term anti-Semite or anti-Semitism actually didn't come into our vocabulary, or at least the German vocabulary, which is where it began, didn't take place until 1879. So based upon that, yeah, I guess you could, if this is a term that showed up first in Germany in the 19th century, the latter half of the 19th century, and it was in the context of speaking of Jew hatred, well then fine. Anti-Semitism can, in fact, then be understood as solely referring to hatred against the Jews, not hatred against the Semitic race, which would include Arabs. That was something I learned in this little study here. So the encyclopedia entry continues, anti-Semitism may be manifested in many ways, ranging from expressions of hatred of or discrimination against individual Jews to pogroms by mobs, state police, or even military attacks on entire Jewish communities. So that is, I think, a useful place to start. And if we're talking about anti-Semitism, I agree with what we just read. Hopefully that will be helpful going forward. Actually, I think, yeah, actually the article goes on. So this is the second slide, same article in the encyclopedia. Although the term did not come into common usage until the 19th century, it is now also applied to historic anti-Jewish incidences. Notable instances of persecution include the Rhineland massacres preceding the First Crusade in 1096, which is an interesting story. It was part of the Crusades. When the Crusaders went out looking for the evil Muslims in the Holy Land, they actually, on their route, passed through the Rhineland of Germany. They didn't know what a Muslim looked like, and they thought a Jew looked like a Muslim, and they actually started slaughtering the Jews, long before they got to the Holy Land. So this is what's referring to here, the Rhineland massacres preceding the First Crusade in 1096. It continues the Edict of Expulsion from England in 1290, the massacres of the Spanish Jews in 1391, the persecutions of the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the Cossack massacres in Ukraine. I lost a hyphen there from 1648 to 1657. Various anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire between 1821 and 1906. The 1894 to 1906 Dreyfus Affair in France. The Holocaust in German-occupied Europe, which is probably what we're most familiar with. Official anti-Jewish policies and I guess today, Arab and Muslim involvement in the Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim countries. So that's all I wanted to share as far as the article, encyclopedia entry on anti-Semitism. It goes on and on, but that's enough. So in light of the last paragraph, I wonder to myself, how far back in time can we find anti-Semitism recorded? Now, the encyclopedia entry up above goes as far as back at 1096. But anti-Semitism definitely goes back even further than the year 1096. So let me stop talking and get some of you to provide some input. Let me ask you the question, what are some of the oldest accounts of anti-Semitism that you know of? The oldest accounts of anti-Semitism that we are aware of. Randy?
I forgot his name, but the fellow in Persia, Haman, who wanted to kill all of the Jews in the empire.
Egypt, so Pharaoh in Egypt. Okay. Any other examples?
I know in the New Testament there's a mention of the Jews being expelled from Rome.
Okay.
And there were some believers that had been caught up in that.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was under Claudius or it made one reference to, yeah.
And there was Antiochus, or however you say his name, Epiphanes.
All right, so it's Antiochus Epiphanes. This is actually between the Bible, in between the Old and New Testament. That's when the Greeks had supplanted or replaced the Medes and the Persians, and one particular nasty king, a Grecian king, named Antiochus Epiphanes, sacrificed, I believe it was a pig, on an altar within the temple grounds and desecrated the holy place. And also then the uprising, which stirred up the Maccabean revolt, and then of course the persecution of fighting against the Jews then. Any other examples? Esther, what about Esther? So we had Haman and his plan to destroy all the Jews. Okay, any others? Randy?
Well, you had the Edomites who, when the Babylonians invaded the land, they were anxious to destroy all the Jews too.
Was that when they said raise it,
Yeah,
referring to the, yeah. There's one other I'm thinking of in the book of Numbers. Anyone remember the story of the donkey and Balaam? So all that was because Balak wanted to hire a prophet or seer to come curse the Israelites. So those would be all examples of forms of anti-Semitism that we have. So let's kind of get a little bit more nuanced. There's another term, it's not anti-Semitism, it's called anti-Zionism. And I want to make sure it's clear, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not the same thing. They're two different things. Now, what's anti-Zionism? Actually, these are some of the examples we're not going to read. So we had Numbers, Esther, and Exodus. So those are all the ones I had, except for Randy's reference to the Edomites. So we'll just save some reading and jump ahead here. So anti-Zionism. What is anti-Zionism? It's the opposition to Zionism. Then you have to say, what is Zionism? Broadly defined in the modern era as the opposition to the ethno-nationalist and political movement of the Jews and Jewish culture that supports the establishment of a Jewish state as a Jewish homeland in the territory defined as the historic land of Israel, also referred to as Palestine, Canaan, or the Holy Land. So, if you were opposed to the restoration of the nation of Israel and its ancient homeland, you'd be an anti-Zionist. Now, that doesn't mean that you're anti-Semitic. Okay, if you make the distinction, here's proof that you can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. There's a large number of Jews who are anti-Zionist, and surely Jews are not anti-Semitic. It's probably little known that prior to World War II, a great number of the Orthodox Jewish rabbis were opposed to the restoration of the nation of Israel in Palestine. As hard as that is to believe, prior to World War II, they thought that going back to Israel prior to the Messiah's arrival would be like getting the cart in front of the horse, because it was the Messiah's job, according to their understanding of Scripture, it was the Messiah's job to bring the people, the Israeli people, back to their homeland. And if they try to do it on their own, it's kind of like, Messiah, we're going to start this without you, okay? You know, I know you're supposed to do this, but we're going to do it ourselves. So that was the thinking. Of course, the events of World War II caused a sea change of attitude within the Orthodox Jewish community. Now, there still are many Jews who are anti-Zionist. If you ever go up to Brooklyn, New York, you probably would come across some of these, often referred to as the Hasidic community. They still are opposed to the establishment of a Jewish state in the Holy Land. They're not opposed if you want to go back to the Holy Land, but you should be living in whatever the conditions are handed out to you at the time. Of course, things have changed, and now we have an Israeli state, but their opposition is in creating a restoration of the kingdom or nation of Israel prior to the Messiah's return. That is their problem with Zionism and with the nation of Israel. So I hope you can see the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. You can speak up.
Sorry. Just to clarify, that would be Messiah's arrival, right? Not return for the Jews?
Jesus' arrival, or the Messiah's arrival.
In the Jews' mind, would it be the arrival of the Messiah, not the return of the Messiah?
Yes, you're correct. I'm speaking as a Christian, of course.
That's why I didn't need the mic for that.
Which is kind of hard when you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of a Jew. The arrival of the Messiah. Thank you very much for that clarification. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm technical, and that's actually accurate. That's a great point. Okay, so let's see what else. Oh, here's a bit of trivia. I'm going to ask a question. So we have terms for anti-Semitism, or more, we have terms for the hatred of the Jews, which is anti-Semitism. We have a term for those who are opposed to the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, anti-Zionism. How about this one? What is a term for those who love the Jews? If there's a term for the hatred of the Jews, you think it would be possible that there's a term for the love of the Jews? You're extremely close. It's either philo-Semitism or Judeophilia. Okay, I didn't know that until just recently. It was coined around the year 1885, probably just about the same time the word anti-Semitism came into the German vocabulary. So philo-Semitism, or philo-Semitism, however you wish to pronounce it, is the defense, love, or admiration of Jews and Judaism. You might say that Christadelphians are philo-Semites to some degree. Would that be a fair assessment? So that then leads to this question. Why do we love? Why do Christadelphians love, and in many cases defend, the Jewish people and their cause? Why do we love the Jewish people and want to see their welfare and their security, their well-being, and the restoration of the nation of Israel? Why do we want these things? Why do we love these causes?
God says, they will be my people and I will be their God.
God says, they are my people, which he has. But does that mean that we should love? Doesn't necessarily follow that we have to love them.
I think it stems from our love for God, knowing that they're so close to him that we kind of impart that on those people because of that.
Jesus told the woman at the well, salvation is of the Jews.
Okay.
So
Salvation of the Jew is of the
it is
Jews.
of the Jews.
Those are valid. I do remember when we were discussing this back in May or June of last year, the verse in Genesis 12, I will bless those who bless you and curse those. I think in this ESV it says, him who dishonors you, I will curse, and then you, all the families of the earth, shall be blessed. That was brought up. I did critique that because the problem is if you read the context, it's actually God speaking to Abraham, not to the Jewish people. And, you know, if you wanted to get technical, you got to remember Abraham had more than one son. He's also not only the father of the Jewish nation, he's also the father of the Arabs, Ishmaelites. He did have a son. So that's why I kind of draw a distinction here. This particular blessing, cursing statement in Genesis 12 is specifically given to Abraham, the man, not to his seed. Now, there are other scriptures that do answer the question that I asked, but Genesis 12:3 in particular kind of falls short for several reasons. But it looked like, Rob, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of complicated because we're intently invested in the Jewish people because God has chosen them as a way by which he reveals himself. So that's kind of how I see the Jewish people. And so there are parts of scripture that say, look, the Jews are going to have a hard time. And so do we cheerlead that when they're having a hard time because it's God revealing himself? No, I don't think we do that. But we also know that they are the apple of God's eye. And it's not because they're special, it's because God called them special, right? And so it's just like the same grace that we receive by being called special even when we're not. So I think it's complicated because then you get the spiritual Israel versus, you know, physical Israel, right? Natural Israel versus spiritual Israel. And so we're really invested in spiritual Israel, right? But the natural Israel is still how God is revealing himself.
All right. So has God always blessed the Jewish people?
Nope.
No. He's called and cursed them. So does that mean we are allowed to curse the Jewish people if God curses the Jewish people? I mean, so the answer to that would be like, look at King David. You know, if you're following the daily readings, you remember David had been anointed king, but he couldn't be king because there already was a king, King Saul. And there were many times where David could have killed King Saul, but why didn't David kill King Saul? Because the Lord had anointed him. And if the Lord's going to anoint him and make him king, well, then it's the Lord's responsibility to remove him. And it was not David's responsibility. So if God curses Israel for some reason, that doesn't mean that we follow suit and have to treat the Jews in an evil, bad manner. Which you'll see later on, I don't know if we'll get into it this morning, but definitely next week, we'll see how for centuries Christians could not get and make that distinction. They saw the cursing that God, you know, the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple in 70 AD, the exodus of Jews into the nations. That was definitely a curse. You could say it was a result of the Jewish people rejecting their Messiah. But that doesn't mean that the Christians should persecute the Jews. It doesn't follow. So anyway, Jessica, I think you were going to say something.
That point you made in Genesis 12, I just wanted to point out, it is reiterated in Genesis 22 after he offers Isaac. He does kind of repeat the same thing, and the implication there seems to be that it is through that seed.
So I've got some verses I'm going to share that I think kind of answer the question why we love the Jewish people or want to see their welfare or pray for their welfare. get up there first. So that's, okay, we talked about Genesis 12:3. So that was the promise or the statement by God to Abraham. So the next one is from Numbers 22, which says, "And God said to Balaam, thou shalt not go with them, thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed." Okay. So if God is blessed to people, and here we have an exact, so in contrast to the Genesis 1 verse, which is God speaking directly to Abraham, here we definitely have confirmation that God has blessed, at least at the time of Numbers, God had blessed the nation of Israel. Okay, so there we have a confirmation that the nation itself has been blessed, at least at one point in time. Let's see some more. In Numbers also 24, God brought him, that is the nation of Israel, forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn, or I think some say like a wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce them through with his arrows. He couched, he lay down as a lion, as a great lion. Who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blesseth thee, and cursed is he that curseth thee. I think that's actually, could be wrong. I separate it from the context, but I think that's the context of Balaam blessing the Israelites. So Balaam is pronouncing this blessing, and cursed are those who curse the nation of Israel, at least at that time. So the next one is very familiar to us. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure, or I think our hymnal said prosper who love you, from Psalm 122, verse 6. Another, Zechariah 8, talking about the future, thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Again, in the future, but still, it confirms that if God is prospering and using the Jewish nation as a witness, then we definitely need to respect his servants and agents. All right, so jumping into, this one's in the New Testament. It's concerning the gospel, they, the Jewish people, are enemies for your sakes, but as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sakes. And then Isaiah 43. This is one I think I want to tie into what Rob was saying. Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, and neither shall there be any after me. So I think this is extremely important to understand. The Jewish people are witnesses to God. And in that sense, if you try to destroy his witnesses, what are you doing? What are you essentially saying? That I don't believe in the God of Israel. If God is using the nation of Israel and you're trying to destroy that nation, you could make the argument that you're actually trying to destroy God or reject the God whose witnesses the Jewish people represent. So those are some of the verses I would, I guess if I was out there and someone was asking me the question, I would kind of throw, those would be some of the verses I would use, minus the Genesis 12 one. Yeah, I guess in some sense, Rob, it's right. It's complex. It's complex. And you need to be very careful, because you could step into the mistake of, God cursed them, we can curse them. And that is, in fact, the attitude of many Christians over the last, 1,800 years, 1,900 years. But again, we'll get into that later. So let me flip the question. Why would some people hate the Jews? We talked about why we, favor the Jewish cause. Why would some people hate the Jews? Roger?
Well, one of the examples was in World War II, how they confiscated all the Jewish businesses and things like that, because as the scripture said, that they would be lenders of money and not borrowers of money. So as a nation as a whole, they were very good at managing business and things like that. And a lot of people were very jealous about that and would think that they got there by ill-gotten ways. You know, they put all kinds of labels on them and they confiscated their property, things of that nature.
So the answer is simple envy financial. It is these people over here are very prosperous. I'm not. I envy them. Therefore, I hate them. They're perhaps doing it. They're getting rich unjustly or unfairly. Yeah. So that could be a reason to hate particular people.
I think the fact that they have never really gone away as a group of people, they're resilient. They don't appearingly need anybody. Like, they help each other out. They stick together. They thrive wherever they go, and they really don't need anybody appearingly, you know? So, I mean, there's been times in history when they've been helped by outsiders a lot, obviously, when you hear stories from the Holocaust and things like that. But if you look at them as a culture, you could almost think, well, they must think they're too good for us, you know, like that they might think they're too good for everyone else because they don't really need anyone else.
It's interesting. We just came back. Lisa and I just came back from main Bible school, which of course up in Finger Lakes, New York. Have you ever been out there? Often we will find a lot of these people, you know, the Amish riding bodies were riding bicycles on the side of the road. Could you make the argument like the same thing? What would be the difference? You know, the Amish do not assimilate. The Jews don't haven't assimilated. Do we hate? Are there instances of people hating the Amish to the same degree that people hate the Jews? I mean, the most you might say is, you know, well, they need to clean up the horse, you know, on the side of the road. That would be the only reason why maybe, you know, you step in and say, oh, oh, sorry. So it occurred to me, why don't we hate the Amish? Or why hasn't there been historic hatred to the Amish as there has been for the Jewish people? Why is it the Jewish people always seem to get such hatred and vitriol thrown at them?
Well, one reason is because God said that was going to happen, but for the early Christians, it was because they blamed the Jews for crucifying Jesus.
Yeah, or killing God if you happen to believe that Jesus was God.
That was your comment.
Any other reasons for? I'm not saying we should. This is just simply, you know, why do people hate the Jews?
For a large portion of a certain population of people, it's going to be because they stole our land. It really belongs to us, and they say it's theirs because our most holy site's there and it belongs to us. And their God's not our God, and they're infidels. And so we have to stand against all this stuff lest they take over.
Yeah, so there's an interesting distinction between the Amish and the Jews. The Amish, we would say, have the same God as, well, worship Jesus, kind of have, you know, we agree to the same scriptures. The Jewish people, no. They believe Jesus was, you know, an imposter or deluded. So there's one difference why we don't see anti-Amishism, if there is such a term, versus anti-Semitism. Elisa, I think you had... Okay. We running out of time? We normally wrap it at 25 after? I guess whenever Rob stands up and takes over. All right. So where I'm going with this, next week, I want to show you what has happened within Christianity and why Christianity has often been blamed for much of the anti-Semitism that the Jews have had to endure. I know it sounds odd, but honestly, a lot of anti-Semitism, what has happened in the way of pogroms, persecution of the Jews, can be laid at the feet of the church, Christian church. Not us, as Christadelphians, but historically, the historical church, including the Protestants. And we'll get into that next week. So any questions or last comments? All right, well, I appreciate the attention.